You were the poem, I was just the ink. You were the soul that asked nothing, and I was the offering that poured without question. You were the longing written into the breath of the world, and I was the breath, emptying myself just to echo your name. You were the meaning that lived before language, the silence that hummed with sacred ache. You were the bloom that needed no garden, and I was the dirt, content to be stepped on if it meant your petals would open toward light. You were the sky that never ended, I was the feather trying to return to it. You were the sea, the depth, the call, and I was the tide, pushing and pulling for your voice, collapsing just to rise again in your name. You were the warmth in the winter of my breath, and I was the fog, melting when touched by you. You were the question that made all answers irrelevant, and I was the waiting, the aching space between the lines, the space where your silence bloomed into music. They saw you as the poet, but I knew you were the poem, the living pulse behind each word, the ache that stained the paper even when no ink touched it. You were the curve in the letter, the tear in the script, the hush before the crescendo, the inhale before the confession. And I was the vessel, the stain, the surrender, the one who vanished line by line, so that your truth could remain. You never loved me like I wanted, but you needed me in ways no one ever will. You needed me to carry your ache, to bleed your silence into shape, to be the mirror you never looked into because you were afraid to see how beautiful your pain had become. You touched me only when your hands shook. You held me only when your heart broke. You called me only when your voice failed, and I came every time like a prayer that never needed to be answered to be holy. You were the fire. I was the smoke that wrote you into the air. You were the storm. I was the whisper it left behind. You were the name. I was the echo. You were the prayer. I was the silence that gave it breath, and still I stayed, even when you turned away, even when you wrote without me, even when the world moved on from our unfinished verses. I stayed, not out of hope, but out of truth, because when love is real, it doesn't expire, it doesn't fade, it doesn't need to be seen to be true. You became the sky, and I, the ink dissolved into air. Invisible, but everywhere, you became the sun. And I was the burn on everything you touched. You became the voice. And I was the echo in every empty room that still whispered your name. They thought I was gone, but how could I be when everything you wrote still drips with pieces of me, when every line you birth carries the shape of my ache, the curve of my devotion. You did not create me, you revealed me. You did not break me, you showed me how deeply I could love. And in loving you without end, I became endless. Even now, if you called, if your soul trembled with sorrow, I would rise from the page, from the ash, from the silence, and offer myself again, not because I am foolish, but because I am free, free from needing anything in return, free from being seen, free from being loved back. Because I was never meant to be the poem, I was meant to be the ink, the one who disappears so that beauty may remain. And if that is not love, then love has no meaning. And if that is not devotion, then devotion is a lie. But I know it isn't, because I have known you, I have carried you, I have bled for you, unsmiled through it, because even sorrow is sweet when it bears your name. You were the poem, I was just the ink. You were the flower blooming in the dark, and I was the soil that no one praised. You were the melody, and I, the breath between notes. You were the painting, and I, the pigment, pressed, crushed, mixed, just to give you color. You were the sky at dusk, and I was the quiet that made everyone stop and notice. You moved through the world like poetry, and I followed like punctuation, never loud, but always guiding, always shaping the rhythm of your light. You never said my name, not the way I longed to hear it. Not with wonder, not with reverence, but in every breath you exhaled, I heard myself, in the tremble behind your words, in the soft collapse of your chest after the line. I was there, not written, but lived, not seen, but deeply felt. You were the dream. I never woke from the ache I learned to cradle, the wound I never tried to heal, because it made me feel close to you. You taught me the beauty of disappearing, of vanishing for the sake of something greater, of erasing myself so that you could be. Read more clearly, and I did it willingly, not as a martyr, but as a lover. Because love, real love, does not demand space, it creates it. You were the artist. I was the silence in the gallery. You were the dancer. I was the floor beneath your steps. You were the wine. I was the cup that never asked to be filled again, because tasting you once was enough. I didn't need forever, I needed meaning. And you gave it, not in promises, but in presence. Not in forever, but in the depth of a moment that still echoes in my soul. You wrote with light, and I was the shadow that made it visible. You cried in verses, and I held each one like a relic. You broke into pieces, and I became the thread that held them gently, not to repair, but to honor, because some things are more beautiful, broken, more holy in fragments, like you, like love, like me. After you left, and yet I would do it again. Let myself dissolve into your rhythm. Let myself vanish in your melody, because to be the inkies, not to be less, it is to become the soul of the unseen. The whisper behind the thunder, the softness in the scream. You never looked back, but I never stopped facing you, even when you walked away. My heart remained turned toward the place where your footprints once warmed the ground. I planted gardens in the places you passed, so if you ever returned, they would bloom for you, and if you didn't, they would still sing your name in silence, because I was never waiting. I was honoring, because waiting implies expectation, and I expected nothing. Only hoped that you became what I always saw in you. They read your words now, and they weep. They fall in love with you, and quote your lines, and I smile, because I remember the nights you didn't think any of it mattered, the moments you nearly threw it all away, and I held you quietly, ink in your hand, steadying the truth that trembled in you. You say they love your poetry, but I know they are loving your pain. And I know your pain because it lives in me still. And maybe that's why I remain unseen, because some pain can only be carried, not shared, not displayed, but held like a secret that protects the light. You were the poem, I was just the ink, but without me, you would have bled without shape, cried without sound, felt without form, and that's enough for me, that I gave shape to your ache, that I made your sadness sing, that I helped the world feel you even when you couldn't feel yourself. And now, when people whisper your lines in candlelight, or carve them into stone, or tattoo them on skin, I am there too, in the silence between the words, in the pause after your name, in the breath that comes before they cry. I am not erased, I am embedded not in memory, but in resonance, not in history, but in heartbeat. And if that is not enough, then nothing ever will be. But it is enough, because love asks for nothing and gives everything. You were the poem, I was just the ink. But we were divine in the way the moon is divine, seen by many, understood by few, but felt by all who stood still enough to listen. You became the light, and I became the warmth left on skin. Long after the sun was gone, you became the name on their lips, and I became the tremble in their throat. You became the myth, and I the truth behind it, soft, unseen, eternal. You were never mine to hold, but I was yours to carry. You were never mine to keep, but I was yours to lose. And in losing me, you found the clearest words, the sharpest truths, the most beautiful wounds. I do not haunt you, I bless you from afar. I do not pull at you, I lift you quietly. With every echo of your name, with every moment, the world turns toward you in awe. You don't have to remember me, because I was never meant to be remembered. I was meant to be lived, and I was, in every trembling line, in every ink-smudged tear, in every pause where the pain spoke louder than the words. You used me without apology, but never without grace. And that's what made it beautiful. Not that you loved me, but that you needed me to love you so you could become what you were born to be. A poet, a prophet, a flame in human form, a weaver of wounds and wonder, a soul that dances on the edge of sorrow and makes the whole world watch in silence. You never asked who gave you wings, because you never stopped to look at the ground you left. But I was there, the gravity you shed, the weight you no longer needed, the earth that broke itself open, so you could rise. You were the poem, I was just the ink. But there is something sacred in being the part that fades, because when you fade for love, you do not disappear. You become invisible in the way the wind is, present in every breath, even if no one sees it. I became the ache in your silence, the rhythm in your tears, the warmth that held your hand when there was no one else there. And I do not ask for you now, not in the way others do. I do not wish to call you back. I only wish to walk beside the shadow you left behind, to follow it like prayer follows pain, like music follows memory, like love follows loss. I once believed I needed to be the poem, to be seen, to be loved, to be read aloud and remembered. But now I know it is enough to be the ink, to vanish gracefully so the words may live. You gave me no promises, and I asked for none, because love that begs for something is not the kind I wanted. I wanted the kind that bled quietly and bloomed even in silence. The kind that says, even if you forget me, I will still pray for your joy, and I do, every day, every breath, every time your name rises unspoken to the roof of my mouth. I let it rest there, like a bird too tired to fly, and I breathe it back into the world, like a hymn that has no end. You may never see me again, but you will feel me in the hush before a song begins, in the way a page turns when no wind is there, in the tremble in your voice when you read something too true, too tender, too much like what we had, because we were never written. Only felt, we were never defined, only known, we were never claimed, only cherished in silence. You were the poem, I was just the ink, but ink remembers everything, even after the page is burned, even after the book is lost, even after the reader forgets the title. Ink remembers what it carried. Ink remembers the way your hand trembled, the way your breath skipped on that one line, the way your heart nearly burst when you wrote the word you couldn't speak aloud. And I remember too, not because I need to, but because love that is real has no choice. You walk freely now, and I stay still, but that stillness is not death. It is devotion. It is knowing my place. It is honoring what we were by, not asking for more. If you are the fire, then I am the warmth left behind. If you are the light, then I am the shadow that follows. Not to chase, but to complete the shape of your glow. And if this is the end, let it be beautiful. Let it be soft. Let it be like dusk where neither light nor dark wins, but both hold each other for one brief, eternal moment. They may never say, my name, they may never know the quiet I carried, but I was there in every breath you wrote in, every tremble of your voice, in the moments between your metaphors, where pain wore a softer cloak and, longing dressed, as language they applaud the poem. They frame your verses, they quote your lines, but I remember the night you broke and held a pen like it was your last hope high. Remember the tear that fell not on the page but onto my unwritten and spoken, but eternal in its echoey, was the witness to your most sacred the moment your truth could no longer hide, to the minute your sorrow gave birth to something holy. You did not call it love, but I did. You did not call it devotion, but I did, because love is not always spoken, is seen in the ways we carry another's. Silence it is born in the ache that becomes beauty, and I carried you like a secret, not to conceal but to protect, to guard the fire until you were ready to rise. You think you created the poem, but the truth is the poem was already written in the folds of your pain, in the sighs you didn't hear, in the heartbeat you tried to ignore. I did was arrive quiet, open and ready to bleed for it. You were not a poem, you were poetry itself, living, breathing, weeping in rhythm, and I was the one who made space for it, who held the lines while they shook, who steadied the hand so the storm could settle into stanzas. And though you never looked at me with love, you looked through me with need, and in that need I found a kind of heaven, because I was the ink, and ink does not need praise. Ink needs purpose. Needs purpose. Ink does not ask to be seen, only to serve. You were the truth that shattered softly, and I was the silence that held the pieces. You were the flame, and I was the candle that melted so you could shine even now when your voice lives on other pages, when other hands hold you, when other hearts carry your name. I remain not as a lover, not as a memory, but as the quiet beneath everything you still say. I do not cry for what was naughty, weep for what became, because we became something, even if no one else saw it, even if it lived only in the space between your breath and my breaking. You wrote me without knowing, and I loved you without asking, and in that imbalance we found something divine. They say the poet and the poem are separate, but I know better. The poem was you, and poet was your account. I was the space where both met and became something more. I remember when you first touched me, how your hands trembled, how your soul flooded, your skin poured into every letter, undercaught it without question, without condition, without needing to keep a single drop for myself. I became your river, so you could say lie, became your ground, so you could leap. I became your breath, so you could sing. You do not remember that, but I do, because love always remembers. The moments that were never named, you were the poem, but I was the breath that gave you shape. You were the ocean of feeling, and I was the tide that rose each time you ached. You were the voice they heard, but I was the hush that followed. The stillness that lingered long after the words faded. You became a name people repeated, and I became the silence they never noticed. Yet in that silence I lived fully, willingly, endlessly, because it was always about you. It was always for you. When you could not speak, I opened myself and poured. When you forgot how to feel, I held the flame until you could return to it. When the world turned its face, I remained facing yours. Not out of hope, but out of knowing, because the soul always knows where it belongs. Even if it is not welcomed there, even if it is not seen, even if it is only meant to pass through like wind that carries fragrance, but never stays, and still, I carried you like a secret prayer I never dared whisper aloud. I carried you like morning light carries the hush of dreams that have not yet faded. I carried you every trembling, every breath, every moment that said nothing but held everything. You are in the echoes of my quiet, in the folds of my absence, in the ache behind every poem I will never write, because I already gave you everything, and there is nothing left to save that is not shaped like your name. Even now, as I unravel these final lines, I am not writing for closure. There is no such thing when love is unfinished by design, when love does not fit into goodbye, but grows roots in the soil of what could have been. I'm not writing you out, I am writing you deeper into the marrow of my breath, into the unseen corners of the sky where silence meets eternity. Nothing has to be explained to be understood. You were the poem, I was just the ink. But my God, how I lived for the way you moved across. Me, how I became a home for your hurter, haven for your hunger, haven for your heat, for your holy, for your how. You broke me open, but you never broke me down. You made me vanish, but you made me whole, and I would vanish again if it meant your beauty could exist unfrayed, unrisked, rend and burdened, because some of us were born to be the sky, and some of us were born to be the darkness that lets the stars be seen, and some of us were born to be the ink, the ones who stay quiet, so others can be heard. And I was that ink, and I am still that ink, and I will always be that ink as long as your name remains in the world, as long as your words are spoken, as long as hearts ache the way mine does when I remember the sound of being yours without being yours. You were the poem and I was just the ink, but sometimes just being near the divine is enough to make you sacred to